At 12:41 in the morning, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 left Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The Boeing 777 was carrying 239 people. Its destination was Beijing. For the passengers, this was supposed to be an ordinary overnight flight. Nothing about the departure suggested that history was about to change. The aircraft climbed normally. The crew communicated with air traffic control. The flight followed its planned route toward the South China Sea. And for a while, everything appeared completely routine. Then, at 1:07 a.m., the aircraft sent its last ACARS report. ACARS was a system used to transmit operational information between the aircraft and ground systems. The report showed that the aircraft was still functioning and had enough fuel to remain airborne for several more hours. But the next expected ACARS messages never arrived. At 1:19 a.m., came another transmission. The cockpit exchanged a final radio message with Malaysian Air Traffic Control. The words were ordinary. There was no emergency declaration, no warning, no desperate request for help, nothing that suggested 239 people were about to disappear. And then MH370 crossed into the next phase of its journey. Its communications became silent. But this is where the story becomes strange, because the aircraft had not simply disappeared from the sky. Something else was happening. Radar data later showed that the aircraft turned away from its planned route. It crossed back over the Malaysian peninsula and continued toward the west. That turn became one of the most important clues in the entire investigation. And yet, at that moment, the people watching the flight did not know where this was leading. The aircraft was still flying. It was still moving. It was still somewhere above Earth, but the world was about to lose track of it, and the question that would follow would become almost impossible to answer. How does a modern passenger aircraft carrying 239 people disappear from the world's tracking systems while continuing to fly? Because MH370 did not simply vanish, it left a trail, and the first clue was already waiting in the radar data. At first, the disappearance did not look like a disappearance. It looked like a communication problem. At 1:07 in the morning, the last ACARS transmission was recorded. 14 minutes later, at 1:21 a.m., MH370's secondary radar position disappeared. The aircraft had passed waypoint Agari, the point where it was expected to continue toward Vietnam. Then came the final radio transmission. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Those were the last recorded words from the cockpit. No emergency call, no declaration of mechanical failure, no request to return to Kuala Lumpur. Nothing. Air traffic controllers expected the aircraft to appear on the Vietnamese side of the radar system. It didn't. At first, authorities searched in the South China Sea because that was where the aircraft was expected to be. But there was a problem. They were looking in the wrong direction. Military radar data was later examined more closely, and that data revealed something extraordinary. After disappearing from civilian secondary radar, an aircraft consistent with MH370 had turned back. It crossed over the Malaysian peninsula. Then it continued toward the Malacca Strait. The aircraft had not simply fallen from the sky. It had apparently changed direction and kept flying. That changed everything, because now investigators had two completely different stories. The first story was the one everyone initially believed. A plane flying toward Beijing suddenly disappears somewhere near the South China Sea. The second story was much more disturbing. A plane disappears from civilian tracking, turns around, crosses Malaysia, and continues west. But even that wasn't the strangest part. The military radar eventually lost the aircraft too. And yet, later analysis showed that MH370 continued to generate satellite communication signals for hours afterward. That meant the aircraft was still alive in some sense. Its systems were still communicating. The world simply could not see where it was. Imagine watching a plane disappear from radar, and then discovering that somewhere beyond the radar's reach, it was still flying. The search now had to change. Instead of one obvious location, investigators faced an enormous question. If MH370 had turned west, how far had it gone? And more importantly, why did it turn at all? Because once investigators reconstructed that turn, the mystery became much darker. The aircraft had not merely disappeared, it had left its planned route behind. The most important clue may have appeared just minutes after MH370 disappeared from civilian radar. The aircraft had been heading toward Vietnam. Then it turned. Not gradually. It changed direction and began traveling back across the Malaysian peninsula. Malaysian military radar later tracked a primary radar target consistent with MH370 after the aircraft's transponder stopped providing its normal secondary radar signal. The target continued westward and was eventually lost near waypoint Mekar. That created a disturbing contradiction. The aircraft was no longer behaving like a plane, simply continuing toward its destination. It had crossed its planned route, it had turned back, and it continued flying. But there was something investigators could not determine from the radar alone. Who, or what, caused the turn? A mechanical failure could potentially explain a loss of communication, but it does not automatically explain a major change in direction. A fire could have affected aircraft systems. But again, that does not by itself explain the entire flight path. And if the turn had been deliberate, another question immediately followed. Why? The military radar data was especially important because it showed that the aircraft's movement was not simply a single unexplained radar blip. The Malaysian investigation concluded that the radar track's behavior and characteristics were consistent with MH370. Yet the aircraft was not intercepted. It was treated as friendly, and then the radar target disappeared. At that point, investigators had a new problem. They knew MH370 had turned. They had evidence that it continued west, but they still did not know where it went afterward. Then another piece of technology entered the story. It was not designed to track a missing aircraft. It was never meant to become the most important clue in the investigation. It was simply a satellite communication system. And that system had something to say, because after the aircraft vanished from conventional tracking, MH370 was still talking, not with words, not with a radio call, but with signals. And those signals would eventually push the search thousands of kilometers away from where everyone had first been looking. The aircraft had disappeared from conventional radar, but MH370 had not completely disappeared from technology. 3 minutes after the last primary radar return, the aircraft's satellite communication system initiated a log-on sequence through an Inmarsat satellite connected to a ground station in Perth, Australia. This was not a normal conversation. There was no voice, no message from the pilots, no position report. Instead, the system exchanged brief automated signals. Investigators later called them handshakes, and these tiny signals became some of the most important evidence ever recovered from the flight. At 1825 UTC, MH370's satellite system logged back onto the network. Then, roughly an hour later, the ground station sent another signal. MH370 responded. Another hour passed. It responded again, and again, and again. The pattern continued through the night. At 0019 UTC, the aircraft itself initiated another log-on request. That became the seventh and final handshake. Less than an hour later, the aircraft failed to respond to another satellite interrogation, and that final silence may have been the moment the aircraft's journey ended. But the satellite signals contained something investigators could use. Every handshake carried timing information. The signal had traveled between the aircraft, the satellite, and the ground station. By measuring the timing of those transmissions, investigators could estimate how far the aircraft was from the satellite. That did not reveal one exact location. Instead, it created enormous arcs across the Earth, 7 possible rings, 7 snapshots of where MH370 could have been. Then researchers added another measurement, the burst frequency offset. This could provide information about the aircraft's movement relative to the satellite, speed, direction, possible flight paths. The mathematics was complicated, but the conclusion was astonishing. MH370 had continued flying for almost 6 hours after its last radar detection. The search had started near the South China Sea. Now the evidence was pointing thousands of kilometers away, toward the southern Indian Ocean. A place so enormous that even knowing the general region was not enough. The satellite had not told investigators exactly where MH370 was. It had done something more frustrating. It had drawn a line, and somewhere along that line was an aircraft carrying 239 people. The final handshake became known as the Seventh Arc. It would eventually become the center of one of the largest underwater searches in history. But there was still a question nobody could answer. Why did MH370 continue flying for so long after communication was lost? And if the aircraft was heading toward the southern Indian Ocean, why did nobody find it? The satellite evidence had transformed the mystery. MH370 was no longer believed to be somewhere near Vietnam. The strongest evidence pointed toward the southern Indian Ocean. But knowing the ocean was one thing. Finding an aircraft on its floor was something else entirely. The first major underwater search eventually covered more than 120,000 square kilometers of seafloor. The area was chosen using satellite communication data, aircraft performance modeling, and analysis of what investigators believed happened near the end of the flight. The environment was brutal. Thousands of kilometers from the nearest major port, search vessels had to operate across an enormous and remote section of ocean. Sonar systems scanned the seabed. Day after day, week after week. The search continued for years, and still, the aircraft was not found. Then came something unexpected. Not the aircraft, not the flight recorders. Debris. In 2015 and 2016, pieces believed to have come from MH370 were discovered across islands and coastlines around the Indian Ocean and Eastern Africa. One major piece, the right flaperon, was confirmed to have originated from the aircraft registered as 9M MRO. Other recovered pieces were also linked to the aircraft through examination and manufacturing records. This was important. It meant MH370 had almost certainly ended in the ocean. But it created another mystery. If debris had traveled thousands of kilometers through the Indian Ocean, why couldn't investigators find the main wreckage? Scientists began modeling ocean currents and debris drift. They worked backward. If a piece of the aircraft was found on a particular coastline, where could it have entered the water? The models pointed back toward the southern Indian Ocean, and the evidence increasingly concentrated around the seventh arc. But even after enormous areas of seabed had been searched, nothing definitive appeared. By January 2017, the governments of Malaysia, Australia, and China suspended the underwater search after more than 120,000 square kilometers had been examined without locating the aircraft. Then another search began. Ocean Infinity conducted a second operation in 2018. The search expanded the total area of seafloor examined to nearly 200,000 square kilometers. Still nothing. No main wreckage, no flight data recorder, no cockpit voice recorder, no complete explanation. The official investigation later acknowledged that without the main wreckage and recorders, investigators could not determine definitively what happened to MH370. And that is where the mystery becomes almost impossible to escape. We know the aircraft continued flying. We know it turned away from its planned route. We know satellite signals continued for hours. We know debris connected to the aircraft reached distant shores. And yet, the aircraft itself remained hidden beneath one of the largest oceans on Earth. But the search had not completely failed, because the debris had revealed something even more important. It could tell investigators how the aircraft may have entered the ocean, and that clue would challenge one of the most important theories about the final moments of MH370. By now, the evidence had created a disturbing picture. MH370 had left its planned route. It had continued flying for hours. Satellite data placed its final movements along the southern Indian Ocean. Debris later confirmed that the aircraft had ended up in the ocean, but the most important evidence was still missing: the wreckage, the flight recorders, and the people who could explain what happened. That left investigators with a problem. They could reconstruct parts of the flight, but they could not prove why it happened, and that is where the theories began. The first possibility was a catastrophic mechanical or electrical failure. Perhaps something went seriously wrong inside the aircraft. Perhaps the crew became unable to communicate, but this theory immediately faced a problem. A failure might explain silence. It does not easily explain the aircraft's major diversion from its planned route. The second possibility was a fire or emergency inside the aircraft. A serious emergency could potentially force the crew to turn back. But again, there was no confirmed emergency transmission, no distress call, no definitive evidence explaining why the aircraft continued for hours afterward. Then came the most controversial possibility. Someone deliberately changed the aircraft's course. The Malaysian investigation examined the diversion and found that the aircraft's route changes were consistent with manipulation of the flight controls, but the investigators could not determine who was responsible or why. That distinction matters. The evidence does not prove who controlled the aircraft. It does not prove a hijacking. It does not prove pilot suicide, and it does not prove any particular person was responsible. The official investigation ultimately could not establish a definitive cause because the main wreckage and flight recorders were never recovered. Then there was another possibility. Perhaps nobody deliberately controlled the aircraft after the initial diversion. Perhaps the aircraft simply continued on autopilot until fuel was exhausted. That theory could potentially explain the long flight. But it creates another question. Who, or what, caused the initial turn? And there was an even darker question. If the aircraft eventually ran out of fuel, what happened during its final minutes? The satellite data and end-of-flight simulations suggested a high and increasing rate of descent near the final transmissions. Debris analysis also indicated the aircraft was not configured for a controlled ditching. So the evidence began narrowing the possibilities, but it still refused to give investigators the one thing they needed: certainty. One theory explained the diversion. Another explained the silence. Another explained the long flight. Another explained the final descent. But no single theory explained everything. And that is why MH370 remains different from an ordinary disappearance. We are not starting with zero evidence. We have radar. We have satellite data. We have debris. We have reconstructed flight paths. We have years of investigation. And still, the central question remains unanswered. What happened inside that aircraft after it turned away from its original route? Because somewhere between the final radio transmission and the last satellite signal, something changed, and that missing moment may be the key to the entire mystery. For years, investigators had been trying to answer one question: where did MH370 end? By 2026, the answer was still frustratingly incomplete. A renewed search by Ocean Infinity surveyed about 7,571 square kilometers of seabed during operations between March 2025 and January 2026, but the aircraft was not found. And that created an extraordinary situation. We have evidence that MH370 continued flying. We have satellite data. We have confirmed debris. We have enormous areas of seabed searched. But the main wreckage is still missing. That means every theory has to survive the same question. Can it explain all of the evidence? Consider the deliberate diversion theory. It explains the turn. It explains why the aircraft moved away from its planned route. But it cannot tell us who caused the diversion. The Malaysian investigation could not determine who was responsible or establish a definitive cause. Now consider the mechanical failure theory. It could potentially explain a loss of communication, but it struggles to explain the complete sequence of route changes. Then there is the possibility that the aircraft continued under autopilot after the initial diversion. That could help explain the hours of flight, but it still leaves the biggest question untouched. What happened at the beginning? And then there is the final descent. Investigators used aircraft performance analysis and satellite data to model possible end-of-flight scenarios. But without the wreckage and recorders, the final moments cannot be reconstructed with certainty. This is the frustrating part of MH370. The evidence is not completely absent. It is incomplete, and incomplete evidence can sometimes be more haunting than no evidence at all, because every new clue seems to answer one question while creating another. The debris proves the aircraft reached the ocean. The satellite data narrows the possible region. The radar data reveals the unexpected turn. But none of these tells us exactly what happened inside the cockpit. And now there is another twist. The aircraft may not simply be missing because investigators searched the wrong ocean. They may have searched the right ocean in the wrong place. The latest search itself provided a strange kind of evidence. Ocean Infinity said that after more than 140,000 square kilometers of seafloor mapped during its efforts since 2018, it could say with confidence that the aircraft was not in the areas it searched. That does not solve the mystery. It makes the remaining search area more important. And Malaysia has now extended its agreement with Ocean Infinity through June 2027, keeping the search alive. So 12 years after MH370 disappeared, the hunt is still not over. But there is one final piece of evidence we have not examined closely enough. The debris. Because if those fragments really came from MH370, they may contain clues about how the aircraft hit the ocean. And that could tell us something about the final seconds of the flight. The next question is not where MH370 went, it is how it ended. The aircraft was missing, but pieces of it were not. That distinction became one of the strangest parts of the entire MH370 investigation. In July 2015, a large piece of aircraft debris was discovered on Réunion Island in the western Indian Ocean. It was a flaperon. Investigators later confirmed that it came from MH370. Other pieces were subsequently recovered from locations around the Indian Ocean and the east coast of Africa, with several assessed as confirmed or highly likely to have come from the aircraft. This changed something important. The question was no longer simply, did MH370 crash into the ocean? The evidence strongly indicated that it did. Now, investigators had a different problem. Where exactly? Ocean currents can carry floating debris enormous distances, so investigators began working backward. If this piece reached Réunion, if another piece reached Africa, if another appeared elsewhere, where could the aircraft have entered the water? The answer kept pointing toward the southern Indian Ocean, and that was consistent with the satellite evidence. But the debris created another contradiction. If large pieces had separated from the aircraft and floated thousands of kilometers, why had nothing from the main wreckage been located? No fuselage, no cockpit, no flight recorders, nothing that could reveal what happened during the final moments. The debris could prove the aircraft reached the ocean, but it could not tell investigators why it was there. And some of the most important questions remained completely open. Was the aircraft under control when it entered the water? Was there an attempted ditching, or was the final descent uncontrolled? Investigators examined the recovered debris and aircraft performance data to test these possibilities. The evidence did not provide a complete answer. Without the main wreckage, the final sequence could not be reconstructed with certainty, and that leaves us with something remarkable. After more than a decade, investigators have managed to reconstruct fragments of MH370's journey from thousands of kilometers away. But the final minutes remain hidden. Malaysia's investigation remains officially unresolved, and the renewed 2025 to 2026 search also failed to locate the aircraft in the areas examined. So perhaps the greatest mystery is not that MH370 left a trail. It did. Radar left a trail. Satellites left a trail. The ocean left a trail. The debris left a trail. But every trail stops before the final answer, and somewhere beneath the southern Indian Ocean, the missing aircraft may still contain the one piece of evidence capable of ending the mystery: the flight recorders. If they are ever recovered, they could finally tell us what happened inside MH370. For 12 years, MH370 has remained hidden. But the search is not officially over. In 2025, Ocean Infinity returned to the southern Indian Ocean with a new underwater search operation. By January 23, 2026, the company had left the search area after mapping more than 140,000 square kilometers of seafloor across its efforts since 2018. MH370 still had not been found. And that created one final twist. The latest search did not prove that the aircraft was somewhere else. It proved something much narrower. It was not found in the areas that had been searched. That distinction matters, because the mystery has never been about whether investigators had evidence. They had plenty. The Malaysian investigation confirmed that available radar and satellite evidence showed MH370 traveling back across the Malaysian peninsula and toward the southern Indian Ocean. But the main wreckage and the flight recorders were never located, leaving the investigation without enough evidence to establish exactly what happened. And now Malaysia has given the search more time. In June 2026, Malaysia extended its agreement with Ocean Infinity through June 2027. The deal remains no find, no fee. So the hunt continues. But there is something haunting about that. Every new search uses better technology, better maps, better modeling, better underwater vehicles, and still the central evidence refuses to appear. The aircraft is somewhere. The ocean did not make it disappear from existence. It only made it extraordinarily difficult to find, and that leaves us with three possibilities. The wreckage is sitting somewhere outside the areas already searched. The existing models of the final flight contain an error. Or, there is something about MH370's final trajectory that investigators still do not understand. We cannot honestly choose between them. Not yet. Because without the wreckage, any confident final explanation becomes speculation. And that is the most important fact in this entire mystery. We know enough to know what happened to the aircraft's journey. We do not know enough to explain its final moments. But there is still one piece of evidence that could change everything. Not a satellite signal, not a piece of floating debris, not another mathematical model. The aircraft itself. Because if MH370 is ever found, the flight recorders could finally answer the question that has remained hidden since that final radio transmission. What happened inside that cockpit? 12 years have passed since MH370 disappeared, and the strangest part is this. The search is still alive. Ocean Infinity's latest search ended on January 23, 2026, after more than 140,000 square kilometers of seabed had been mapped without locating the aircraft. But Malaysia has not closed the case. In June 2026, the government extended its agreement with Ocean Infinity until June 30, 2027, allowing the company to continue searching the remaining priority area. So somewhere beneath the southern Indian Ocean, the missing aircraft may still be waiting. And if it is found, everything could change. The wreckage could reveal the final position. The flight recorders could reveal what happened inside the aircraft. The cockpit evidence could potentially explain the mysterious turn. And perhaps, after all these years, investigators could finally answer the question that began this entire story. Why did MH370 leave its planned route? But until that wreckage is found, we have to separate what we know from what we believe. We know MH370 disappeared during a flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. We know its communications stopped. We know radar data showed a major change in direction. We know satellite communications continued after the aircraft disappeared from conventional tracking. We know debris linked to MH370 reached Indian Ocean islands and African coastlines. And we know multiple enormous searches have failed to locate the main wreckage. What we do not know is why. That is the line investigators cannot cross. And perhaps that is what makes MH370 so haunting. It is not a mystery because there is no evidence. It is a mystery because there is evidence everywhere except where we need it most. A radar trail, a satellite trail, a debris trail, but no final scene, no confirmed wreckage, no definitive explanation, just an aircraft that disappeared into one of the largest and deepest places on Earth. And somewhere below those waves may be the final piece of the story. Until it is found, every theory remains incomplete. Every reconstruction remains partly uncertain. And the last question remains exactly where it was in 2014. Where is MH370? And when that aircraft is finally found, what will it tell us that the ocean has kept secret for 12 years? Like, subscribe, comment, CTA. If you want to uncover more mysteries that still have no clear answer, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what you think happened to MH370. Was it a tragic accident? A deliberate diversion? Or something we still haven't considered? Your theory could be the one detail we missed.